Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to our Club 13 and Club 12 combined session, learning about the Holocaust. We are honoured and really privileged to have Mr. Manfred Goldberg BEM joining us this evening. Mr. Goldberg has given this presentation for our community, I think, 3 times. Is that right, Mr. Goldberg? I think it's about 3 times you've given it over the last few years, and we're really, really pleased you've agreed again so readily to give this session again. It's a fascinating session to hear first-hand from Holocaust survivor is a real privilege. Thank you to John Benjamin once again for arranging this session and all the other sessions as well. The session will be recorded, so anyone who's not been able to make it in person this evening will be able to watch it back. We are very pleased that Mr. Goldberg has agreed at the end of his presentation to take any questions, answer any questions you might have about his life and experiences and his reflections on the Holocaust and life after that. He also has a PowerPoint presentation to share during his talk as well. So, Mr. Goldberg, I'm not going to give you any introduction because it's really, we want to hear your story told in your words. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences with us. And we look forward to what we know will be a fascinating presentation.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your generous introduction. Good evening to you all. You know my name, no need for introductions. And as you heard, I'm here to give you, I hope, some understanding of what the Holocaust actually meant to us who were caught up in it. But before I do, I'd like to sort of make it clear to you that the Holocaust did not happen overnight. The Nazis gained power in 1933 and immediately began passing anti-Jewish legislation, a stream of hundreds of anti-Jewish laws. I will tell you a few of them, but of course we are tightly time constrained. So it'll all be sort of fairly condensed. Well, as soon as they gained power, there was no time wasted from their point of view. One of the first laws they passed was to deprive all German Jews of their nationality, despite the fact that some had lived in Germany for hundreds of years, had been loyal citizens, had actually served in the German army, and some even won medals for bravery. All to no avail. They all lost their nationality. One of the very early things they did. They began expropriating German Jewish businesses. They would make dire threats of sort of terrible consequences if the owner of a business refused to sign it over to a Nazi at a tiny fraction of its actual worth. And of course, most people, to save themselves, had no choice but to agree. By 1938, close to 2/3 of all Jewish businesses have been transferred in that manner, more or less confiscated. Jews had to, very early on, register domestic and foreign assets with the Nazis, and more often than not, again, expropriation followed. Jewish teachers were banned from teaching in non-Jewish schools. Jewish pupils were not permitted to attend public schools. Jewish passports were invalidated. Jews eventually had to voluntarily, so-called, surrender all precious metal, i.e. gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry without compensation. Eventually, Jews were forbidden to attend cinemas or theaters, even to enter public parks, and were forbidden to visit popular holiday towns. Jews were not permitted to own a radio. Jewish driving licenses were invalidated, and we weren't allowed to own bicycles either. And so it went on and on. You get the idea that there are hundreds of these. But I will not waste too much time you can imagine how this progressed from bad to worse to incredibly evil. You know, most likely, about an event which is called Kristallnacht that happened on the 9th of November 1938. It was a nationally organized orgy led by the Nazi military and broadly supported by the civilian population. They roamed the streets and attacked any business that they knew was Jewish-owned. And many of them have been marked with paint to indicate they were Jewish-owned. They were all ransacked, looted, and sometimes if they were larger and stood in their own grounds, they were set on fire. More than 7,000 businesses were in that way looted that night. Any Jew who was unfortunately caught out of doors was attacked. Many of them were injured, and several dozen were actually murdered on that night. Likewise, more than 200 synagogues were ransacked and desecrated, and again, larger ones standing in their own grounds were set on fire. During the height of irony was that following this orgy, the Nazis blamed the Jews for this riot and fined the Jewish community communally 1 billion German marks for the damage caused, which of course was caused by the Nazis in anti-Jewish riots. The world's attitude towards persecution of Jews, and this was all done quite openly. These laws were not passed secretly. There was publicity associated with it. Nevertheless, the world was totally indifferent to it. A few of the so-called generous countries like the USA had annual visa quotas, but were very, very strict, put many difficulties in the way before they granted one of these life-saving visas. There was public criticism of how little America was doing to help Jews. And I think in order to deflect criticism, the Americans organized a conference around June 1938, in which 32 countries participated. It was called in order to help facilitate Jews finding refuge, fleeing Germany. They talked for 2 weeks, they're very sympathetic, but the net result, as far as the availability of visas permitting Jews to enter these countries was concerned, the effect was nil. Everyone talked kindly, but no one opened their gates to allow Jews to enter. In fact, there are academics who feel that this conference may actually have persuaded Hitler to carry on his preparations for mass extermination, because he realized that all the countries did would talk sympathetically, but there would not be any punishment for him if he carried on persecuting Jews. So he did. Jews were forbidden to enter non-Jewish shops. We had to do all our shopping from one shop that was permitted. If they ran out of things we needed, we had to do without. My parents had lived in Germany since 1918. Both were born in Poland. They had 2 children. I was born in 1930. My parents married in 1927. I was born in 1930 and a younger brother in 1934. In the spring of 1939, my father was arrested and deported to Poland after having lived in Germany for 20 years as a respectable citizen. The Poles refused to accept him, sent him back to Germany, and the Nazis scheduled him to be sent to a German concentration camp. My mother courageously pleaded with the Nazis to have him released, but they said the only possibility of release would be if he could show a visa permitting him entry into another country. My mother tried every possible avenue to attempt to get a visa for him, unsuccessfully, until finally she tried the British consulate in Berlin. She met there a remarkable person who was the British passport officer. I cannot go into details. If you go online with the name Frank Foley, you will find a heartwarming story. He listened to my mother's heartbreaking tale and immediately gave her a single visa entitling my father to enter the UK. And he also promised her that within a matter of weeks, we, the family, would receive visas from him to follow my father to the UK. The Nazis insisted that my father leave Germany within 24 hours, and reluctantly, but under the impression that we'd be reunited in the UK within weeks, he left on the 20th of August, 1939. Unfortunately, the World War began 2 weeks later, and we were now trapped in Germany, my mother with 2 young children. Life was increasingly difficult. I cannot spend more time on sort of informing you of what we had to go through, but it was not easy. Eventually, at the end of 1941, we were arrested. My mother was told that she had 10 minutes to pack a suitcase, and then we had to accompany 2 soldiers who took us to the railway station, where we joined a large group of Jews already assembled, and eventually around 1,000 of us were packed into a train and set off for an unknown destination. We traveled for 3 days and 3 nights, and we found we had been taken to Riga, the capital city of Latvia. If I may please have the first image. It will show you the distance we have been taken. There should be a map on show which shows you the town where we used to live. Bottom left, it says Kassel, Germany. That was the town we lived in. And top right, the arrow shows you the town we had been taken to in Latvia. We were marched into the town and had to enter a barbed wire surrounded area of town, which was the Riga ghetto. We were housed in a few houses, grossly overcrowded. There were about 25 people allocated to each small house. We were immediately put on a starvation diet on arrival, and this starvation diet continued unrelentingly for 3.5 years until the day of our liberation. You see a primitive sketch of the Riga ghetto. You can see it was quite small, just a few streets, and eventually there were more than 30,000 German Jews housed in this ghetto. We found out in a matter of days that this ghetto had been occupied by 30,000 Riga Jews who were all forced to leave their accommodation and live in the ghetto around August of that year, August 1941. After several months in the camp, the Nazis lied to them, told them they would be transferred to another camp, and instead marched them into a nearby forest where 3 enormous pits had been dug. And as each group came closer to these pits, they were shot and either fell into or was thrown into one of these pits. In a matter of little more than 1 week, they had murdered all 30,000 of these Riga Jews. And we were the replacements to fill this ghetto again, which they had now made empty by murdering all the inhabitants. 30 young Latvian Jews, Riga Jews, were saved. And their reason primarily was that they were fluent German speakers. They were appointed as camp police in the ghetto, now occupied by German Jews. They didn't have much power except to keep internal peace. We were addressed by an SS officer who told us that we would be divided into work groups and had to be marched out of the camp daily to work in Nazi owned factories, all producing goods to further the Nazi war effort. Children under the age of 13 were in this camp, but in this camp only, excused from work. We stayed in the camp all day. I had to look after my younger brother. I was now aged 11, he was 7. There was in our group one gentleman who had been a teacher in the Jewish school I attended in Kassel. And he knew me, he had taught me. He became very concerned about these children being left unattended. And he eventually managed, from the sort of internal Jewish committee appointed by the Nazis, to organize the camp internally. They gave him use of one room daily, and all the children from the Kassel transport assembled there. And this gentleman, whose name is Herr Bacher, attempted to teach us. When that didn't work, because he had no facilities at all, and the children's ages ranged from 2 or 3 up to 12. So he formed us all into a choir and began teaching us Hebrew songs, nigunim, melodies which most of us were familiar with from going to synagogue with our parents, like Adon Olam, Yigdal, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, that type of melody. When I passed my 12th birthday, he said to me, normally it would be your father's job to do this, but as he's not with you, would you like me to help you prepare for your bar mitzvah? There had been no minyan that I had ever attended in the camps. Pre-war, I used to go with my father as a little boy to synagogue. And I said, yes, please. And his name was Bacher. I addressed him as Herr Bacher. He taught me what he had calculated to be my bar mitzvah seder, which he said was tzad, in March 1943, on the Shabbat, which he decided was my bar mitzvah. He managed to organize remarkably 9 men, and I was counted as number 10. We had a Shabbat morning service, and we also had a Sefer Torah, because when the Riga Jews were forced to leave their homes to move into the ghetto, quite a number were Rabbonim, because there were many synagogues for 30,000 Riga Jews. And of course, quite a few of these Rabbonim each took a Sefer Torah into the camp. And when they were taken into the forest to be murdered, they had to leave all their belongings behind. So we found all these items which belonged to the Riga Jews who were no longer alive. We had one of these Sefer Torah for which I leaned, and it was an unforgettable experience. I do not know of any other young boy in the camps having such an experience. There may have been others, but I've made many inquiries and have not come across it. We had a selection in this camp as well, which meant that we had to shuffle forward single file. An SS officer would look at each person and point left or right. They pointed all the elderly, gray-haired people one direction, the younger people in the other. And again, they lied by telling us that these elderly people would be sent to another camp where the work would be less demanding. In fact, I can tell you now, and it is substantiated as certainly to have happened, you'll find details of it online. They were all sent away to be murdered, just like the Riga Jews. And their clothing was sent back to our camp for sorting before being sent back to Germany. We stayed in Riga until August 1943, when around 2,000 of us, among whom were my mother and us 2 boys, we were all packed into cattle trucks. And from then on, I was in a number of camps. Always the journey was in cattle trucks, never in passenger trains any longer. The doors were locked. We were packed in like sardines. No food, no drink, no water, no, regardless of how long the journey took. Sometimes there was a bucket for sanitary needs, sometimes not. We were never given the name of the next camp. We traveled, didn't know until the train stopped eventually. We were ordered out. We found we had been taken to a purpose-built labor camp. And it meant labor camp. In this camp, everyone had to work. Unless you could work, you did not deserve to live. And we were remarkably surprised. I was the sort that decided to be old enough to slave labor. But there were 4 youngsters, including my little brother, who was now 9, and 3 other young people. They were permitted to stay in the camp during the day. And when we returned from work, we were reunited with these young children. We found it remarkable that they actually appeared to still have a spark of humanity. But the reality was that after 5 weeks in this camp, we came from work one day and found that the children had been taken away to be murdered. My mother and I became part of a group of 300 who were marched out daily to a nearby very busy rail junction where the Allies, realizing the importance of rail transport to the Nazis, they apparently did all their military reinforcing and supplies to the front line via rail. The Nazis began bombing these busy rail junctions to cause maximum disruption to this traffic.
The English, not the Nazis. The English were bombing.
Yes, the Allies were bombing these rail junctions. This was one close to our camp, but many others were bombed all over Germany. It had quite a sizable impact on the German war effort. We were put to work on digging up the bomb-damaged rails, leveling the ground and preparing the ground, and then laying new rail tracks to make the line serviceable again. But as we repaired, the Allies returned to bomb again. We were there for a whole year, being moved from one rail-damaged spot to the next one. But eventually, we were also transported to the next camp. But days before we were taken there, we were subject to another mass selection. You see on screen at the moment an image of workers being taken to work in Nazi-organized factories. They all had to do work to support the Nazi war effort. Many people worked in factories producing bullets or small armaments. Some factories even produced parts for aeroplanes. All uniform, army uniforms. It was all associated with work products to support the war. My mother and I, as I said, worked for this railway repair gang. The second selection differed from the first I've mentioned to you, in that we all had to strip naked on entering the hall. Then naked, we had to shuffle forward single file until we again faced an SS officer who would decide our fate, but usually without saying a word, pointing left or right. As we shuffled forward, the man immediately behind me whispered to me, "If he asks you your age, say you're 17. In fact, I was 14. I bore it in mind, and incredibly, as though that person behind me had had a premonition, Ruach HaKodesh. As I stood before the SS man, he asked me my age. And as this benefactor behind me, I call him a guardian angel in retrospect. As he had prompted me, I replied 17, and I was pointed in the direction of those surviving this selection. I then, naked, had to leave the hall by a particular door and join a group assembling outside, all survivors of this selection. My mother was some distance behind me. I didn't know at the time what her fate was decreed by the SS man, but I know now that she was selected to be murdered. She had to leave by a different door and join her group of people who had been condemned. By now, everyone knew the fate of those who were sent the wrong way. They had to assemble outside, and they all knew that within less than 24 hours, they would be murdered. I joined my group, and no sooner had I reached it, when quite spuriously, apparently, a small group of people from the condemned side began racing across to join our group, mingle among us, and in that way attempting to save themselves. There were guards around who stopped any more people running across. They came over to us and began searching for people who had run across. Some were easily recognized by being elderly, infirm, or gray-haired, wrinkly, and they dragged those back to the condemned side. And it was while this turmoil was going on, I spotted that my mother, Ulea Sholem, had been one of those people who had run across. I saw her mingling among us some distance from me, and remarkably, the guards did not recognize her, and she managed to save her life that day, and in fact survived. She was liberated together with me a little less than a year later. Days after this selection, we were packed into cattle trucks again and transported to a camp which turned out to be Stutthof concentration camp. It was a brutal camp. Here you see a photograph of my little brother, the one on the right, who was taken away. He was one of those 4 children taken away to be murdered. Post-war, we made numerous searches spanning decades that have not found any reference to him anywhere. Although the Germans were quite meticulous often to keep records, the day he was taken away, he disappeared off the face of the earth. To this day, we have no certainty of his fate, although it is pretty certain that the Nazis had no use for non-productive Jews, and these youngsters were murdered. When that selection was over, we were still naked, I told you, and we were not given our clothes back, but we were given these striped uniforms, convict-type uniforms. I wore my uniform of that style. From that day until the day of liberation, it never left my body. We slept in it, we worked in it, we did everything in it. It was never changed, never cleaned, never washed. And it was all we possessed. Everything else had been taken from us. In Stutthof, we became the envy of the camp, being told that we would be sent to another camp. Because once normally one entered Stutthof, that was the main entrance you see now. That gate was known as the death gate, because once you entered Stutthof, it was effectively a death sentence. We, however, spent 3 weeks there and were then sent by cattle truck again to our next labor camp, where we were put to work again, doing exactly the same work that we had been doing in the previous camp, repairing bomb-damaged rail lines, because there was another busy rail junction which the Allies had begun to bomb, and we were doing the same work. This was possibly how we survived Stutthof. We were by now skilled labor, repairing bomb-damaged railway lines, which was vital work for the Nazis to run their railways. In this camp, I remember one atrocity in particular. We all had to assemble one day and watch 8 men being hanged. These 8 men have been taken in reprisal for a group of inmates who, driven by hunger, and hunger is something which is very difficult to make people understand. It's not the sort of hunger when you sometimes perhaps skip breakfast and you feel hungry for lunch. This was ongoing hunger, 24 hours a day, stretched over 3.5 years. And I will do my best to help you understand it a bit later on. They were told that some of the trains, which often stopped in that busy junction, and wagons were uncoupled from one train, coupled to another, there was a lot of this reconfiguration. And they managed to break the seal on a wagon, found some food destined for soldiers. And of course, they helped themselves to still their hunger. These 8 men were taken as reprisals, and we had to watch them being hanged to teach us a lesson, to make sure that we obey German orders. Shortly after this horrific event, we were packed into cattle trucks again and sent to another camp, where on the first morning we had, as always, to line up to be counted. We no longer had names. In our first camp already, we lost our names and were each known by a number which we had to remember. Unlike Auschwitz, it was not tattooed on our arms, but we had to remember it because forgetting often meant physical punishment. I can tell you my number to my dying day, 56478. As the SS officer with a list in his hand, ticking numbers as we had to shout them out, approached me, I kept feeling that he kept glancing at me repeatedly. And as he came closer, indeed, he said, I shouted out my number, and he said to me, when everyone is dismissed to go to work, you stay. I stayed there, trembling with fear, not knowing what was ahead of me. He came along and he asked me to follow him, took me to his accommodation, and I found that he had appointed me as his personal slave. I had to labor for him all day, making his bed, washing his floors, brushing his uniforms, polishing his boots. He made me wash the common parts of the building in which he lived. And I trembled as I worked because I was totally in his power. Had I done anything to displease him, and he would have had me murdered or murdered me himself with a pistol he wore on his belt, there would have been no consequence for him. Fortunately, this daily terror for me lasted only 3 weeks. We were packed into cattle trucks again and transported, not knowing where we would end up. We were terrified to find out we had been returned to this concentration camp of Stutthof. You see an outline of Stutthof here. There were many, many more barracks than you see on the left. And despite the fact that it had a high voltage electric fence, there were still watchtowers at intervals. The Germans were sort of really obsessed with making sure that not a single Jew could escape, despite the fact that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands were murdered all the time. They couldn't bear for any single Jew to somehow regain his freedom. People died every night in their beds, and a group had been formed to have to inspect every bunk bed every morning, pick out the bodies they found, take them to the crematorium, because Stutthof by now possessed a gas chamber and a crematorium, which was built into the camp a year earlier. The camp, for 3 years of its existence, didn't have a gas chamber, but when it was enlarged a year before then, a gas chamber and crematorium were built into the camp. Trainloads of Jews began arriving. Some trainloads were meticulously checked into the camp, and other trainloads were taken straight from the train to the gas chamber and were murdered within hours. The Nazis realized now that the gas chamber they built a year earlier was no longer large enough, they brought 2 additional cattle trucks into the camp and used them as additional gas chambers. The crematorium worked 24 hours a day and had difficulty burning all the bodies. Excess bodies were piled up in the open and eventually set on fire. We had to survive in Stutthof in this manner for more than 4 months, until at the end of April, we were lined up, numbers were called out, and every man whose number was called had to step aside and began to assemble in a separate group. I was one of those. My mother, who was in the women's camp of Stutthof, which was adjoining the men's but separated by barbed wire, was also called out and had to line up in a long column, as I did, but I did not know. Eventually, each of us who had been selected was given a chunk of bread, and we were marched out of the camp. We saw a women's group leaving the women's camp, but we had no idea. I certainly had no idea whether my mother was in that group or whether she was left behind. And eventually these 2 columns merged. So men and women were now marching together under armed SS guards, watching us. Anyone who did not have the strength to keep speed with the column and trailed behind was shot mercilessly. I began wending my way around along the camp, the long column. My mother likewise searched for me, and eventually we found each other. And of course, we were overjoyed that whatever lay ahead for us, whatever fate, we would share it. Eventually, we were packed into 4 ancient wooden barges when we reached a small port after marching for hours and hours. I will come back to the images in a moment. I would like to progress because I have little time left. We were packed into the bottom of each of these barges. We had to sit with our legs wide apart so the next person could sit very close to us, their back touching our front. And 4 tanks manned by SS teams appeared and towed us to sea. All 4 barges were towed to sea. We traveled in this manner for 6 days, but were not given a single crumb of food, apart from the chunk of bread we had been given when we left the camp, nor given a single drop of water. 6 days. And something incredibly horrible happened on a daily basis. Our barge would stop, an SS officer would appear at the top, peer down at that mass of people at the bottom of the barge, and insist that certain people, which he had selected by pointing at them, were dragged up on deck, screaming and shouting and resisting, but to no avail. When they reached on deck, we couldn't see what happened, but we could hear a scream and a splash. On his orders, that person was thrown alive into the sea to drown. He didn't stop at 1 or 2. He selected more than 20 daily and then disappeared, reappearing the next day. And this went on for 6 days. On day 6, the tugs uncoupled themselves and disappeared. We thought they had gone to refuel, but they didn't return after a reasonable time. Among our group, packed into the bottom of the barge, were some prisoners of war who had been fed a better diet at work in the Stutthof camp, and therefore had more physical strength. They clambered on top of deck and found that we were only a few hundred meters from shore. And they did something remarkable. They prized loose some wooden planks, formed themselves into a rowing team, and began attempting to row the barge towards shore so that we could jump off. It took all day. When this group was exhausted, other people were encouraged to take their place, and rowing all day, well into the night, shortly before dawn, we ran aground. Anyone who still had an ounce of strength clambered onto the deck, jumped into the water and waded ashore. Other people were so utterly exhausted, close to death, that they had lost all sense of reality and just remained seated where they were, made no attempt to get off the barge. As this was happening, my mother encouraged me. I jumped, we waded ashore. It was a dark night. We had no idea what to do next. We couldn't see any habitation. We didn't know whether to run left, right, or forward. While this was going on, the tugs with the SS teams returned. They divided into two groups. One mounted the barge, and we heard incessant shooting. All these exhausted people who remained on the barge were murdered. A second group came ashore, rounded us up, formed us into a column. We thought our end had come. They would shoot us as well, but no, they told us to march. And as we marched, again, anyone trailing behind, we were now all 6 days weaker, having had just a chunk of bread for 6 days, nothing to eat or drink since. As we marched along, anyone trailing behind was murdered again, shot without mercy. Eventually, we saw a tank column coming towards us. And as it came closer, suddenly a shout went up from among our group, marching as best we could, still surrounded by armed SS guards. Suddenly, people shouted, "Look, our SS guards have turned, they're running away from us as fast as they can." And indeed they did. They recognized this tank column coming towards us as being an Allied tank column. It was a column of British tanks. And they ran to save their lives. We were overjoyed. I cannot find words to describe to you the pandemonium when we realized that we were now not under guard. We were effectively free. But these tanks did not stop when they reached us. They moved past us and moved on out of sight. They had liberated us quite incidentally by just traveling along the same route as we were marching. And we now began to fear that the SS might return. But within minutes, truckloads of British soldiers appeared, and we realized that our hell on earth period had now ended. They brought truckloads of food, which they began handing out to us. They allowed us to rest. They brought water. And eventually, they marched us into a nearby town called Neustadt. My mother and I spent time in hospital, and a welfare officer interviewed us. We gave what sparse details we had of my father. Eventually, they found him. My father applied for permission to bring us to the UK. It took more than a year before we received permission, but we joined my father in September 1946, more than a year later after our liberation. It was a bittersweet reunion because we were not a complete family any longer. But that was really the beginning of my life. I would like to tell you more about my post-war life, but I feel I have run out of time, because I would like to allow some time for questions to be asked. And maybe some of my post-war life will become clearer to you when I receive and answer these questions. At the moment, I thank you very much for listening and invite you to ask me questions. Thank you.
Mr. Goldberg, thank you for sharing your story. it is an incredibly harrowing story to listen to, for you to have to tell us and for us to listen to. But it's such a privilege to be able to hear your first-hand account of your experiences during the war and the treatment by the Nazis. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? It's a wonderful opportunity to ask Mr. Goldberg.
I'll start with the question.
Thank you, John.
How do you feel about Germans today?
I conducted my own private boycott. For more than 70 years, I'd never set foot in either Germany or any of the countries or camps in which I have been imprisoned during the war. To my amazement, 72 years later, in 2017, I was contacted by the Holocaust Educational Trust, who requested me to return to this dreaded concentration camp of Stutthof to meet Prince William and Princess Kate, who were on a goodwill visit to Germany. They had expressed a desire to visit a concentration camp. And they also requested, if possible, to meet 2 or 3 survivors of the camp. I was selected as one of the survivors. You see the images here now. The second survivor in the photograph on the right, the extreme right, wearing glasses, is my late lifelong friend. We were friends for 78 years, Ziggy Schipper, who sadly died on his 93rd birthday on the 18th of January. The 2 of us, after sort of long consideration, decided to return to this dreaded camp. On the left, that grey building, you see a long chimney there. That was the crematorium. And to my amazement, it survived. In every other camp I know, the Nazis demolished the gas chamber and crematorium before they evacuated the camp at the end of the war. In this one, they attempted to do it, but set the explosive they had laid around both buildings to explode on a timer, and the timer malfunctions. As a result, both survived. Any Holocaust denier should be taken to Stutthof, where they will see largest life in pristine condition, both a gas chamber and a crematorium. That was the one time I set foot on it was now Polish soil. This Stutthof area was pre-war international territory, but the Nazis occupied it, so Stutthof was during the war on German soil. Now post-war, Poland has reclaimed it, and I was now on Polish soil. We had a long conversation with the royal couple. I have met the royals again, and Princess Kate told me that despite the time past, it is now 5 years since we had our long conversation, private conversation with them, they had not forgotten. She told me they had done a lot of reading, but were not prepared for what we told them life was like back during the war, when we were there as 14-year-olds. Ziggy and I remained lifelong friends. He also came to the UK, where he married, had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So this is one time I set foot on German soil. When the royal couple left, they left a message in the VIP visitors book, and I've put it online here for you to read, because I feel it is a message you need to take to heart. I'll give you a chance to read it. Okay. Thank you. I'm ready for your next question.
Mr. Goldberg, Mark Feigenbaum. Firstly, thank you so much for sharing your story with us all. My question is, how did you keep going? Why didn't you give up after seeing everything around you and all these people being murdered What kept you going, and how do you keep your faith today after surviving hell on earth?
Well, I'm extremely short of time to answer. It's a very profound question. How did I keep going? I think the will to survive is one of the strongest possessed by any human beings. And I knew very little about God, very little about religion. I stopped going to school before my 9th birthday because Jewish children were expelled from school pre-war. In the camps, of course, I had no education. So I was physically growing up into a teenager, but educationally, I was a 9-year-old. Nevertheless, the will to survive was powerful. And I decided that each day we survived, we're still alive in the afternoon or evening, was the day I effectively won the lottery. So I lived on a daily basis. The aim each morning was to try and survive that day. My mother, right at the beginning of our time in the camp, had told me that I ought to behave in a manner which so I would effectively not be noticed. That was the safest thing for anyone, she said. And this is what I did. I had to work hard. I tried to work to the best of my ability, because once you began slacking, your life was effectively ended. If Nazis felt they didn't get a solid return on feeding you a starvation diet, you were taken to an execution site and shot. I actually have one image to that effect, which I intended showing you, but so time has run away. If you can go back a bit, you will find that image. And you can take my word for it, you don't need the image. One thing I would like to tell you, that in some of these camps, the majority of our guards were not necessarily SS. Many of them were native volunteers. Like in the first camp in Riga in Latvia, close to 90% of our guards were Latvian Nazi volunteers who became our guards. The Nazis trusted them, put them in uniform, gave them guns, and they were every bit as brutal to us as any Nazi had been. Could I please have the next question? Are you talking about my faith? Well, when I came to the UK, my father, although he lived in agony for 6 years, not knowing the fate of his family, he had not lost his faith, and he expected me to join him. I began going to synagogue with him. I had learned in school, before the school I was expelled, I had learned to read Hebrew. I attended a Jewish school. But when I began reading about the prayers we say in shul, I could not reconcile us thinking of God as a merciful and just God after what had happened to me, what I felt God had permitted to happen to us. And it was only as I began to grow up and began to think more deeply for myself that I began to realize that we experience miracles on a daily basis. I began to understand the seasons as they happened. Who was in charge of organizing the seasons? We could predict exactly when winter began. We could predict what fruit a particular tree would grow. How did that tree know to grow apples and the other tree grow cherries? The miracle of birth began to astound me. You looked at the sky and you saw those trillions of stars. The human digestion is a miracle, how we can extract energy from food and get rid of the waste. What keeps my heart beating? My heart has beaten now for more than 92 years. What makes me breathe without even being aware of it? All these things led me to believe there had to be a divine being, a creator. And therefore, I began to understand that there had to be a God, no matter what I thought of him. But I still could not bring myself to warm towards such a God until somehow it dawned on me that God must be infinite. We, on the other hand, right from the beginning of the earth, the creation of the earth, have been finite beings. We read in the Torah that generation follows generation right up to us. And therefore, as we are finite beings, we have finite minds. And if our minds cannot comprehend why this happened to us, it must be God's will for us not to. And once I began to take that on board, I began to experience faith in that God. Because after what I understood God to be, after I took all those miracles on board, it became clear to me that there is a reason for us being here, and there had to be a reason for the Holocaust, which God has denied us understanding. But despite that, I then began becoming a faithful and believing Jew, and have lived my life from then on in this manner. I hope I've answered your question. I'm not sure if you have time for another one.
We have time for one more quick question. Any of the B'nai Mitzvah, any of the boys or girls like to ask a question?
We were watching a program about the portraits of the Holocaust, which you were on. How did you feel about making a documentary and having your portrait painted?
Well, I can tell you that I was astounded. I received a telephone call once, and it was that the master of the household of, as it was then, Prince Charles, a lord, and he told me he had been instructed by Prince Charles to contact me and tell me that I had been selected as one of 7 survivors to have our portrait painted, and these portraits would then hang in the Queen's Gallery in Buckingham Palace in commemoration of all those millions of Jews be lost during the Holocaust, and in memorial of the Holocaust itself. It should never, ever be forgotten. As you saw from the message I showed on screen, that both the prince and princess penned into the VIP book, they likewise feel that the Holocaust must never be forgotten. And this was Prince Charles's contribution to that end. I was speechless when it happened, and each of us was allocated a distinguished painter. None of us saw the finished product, the finished portrait, until the unveiling, which was in January 2022, when we met King Charles and his queen at Buckingham Palace, and each portrait was unveiled in turn, and the BBC was filming this event. It was really an honor, which is for me to be really beyond words. I don't know how to express my feeling. I feel that I am not being honored personally, but as part of a project to help ensure something I believe fervently, and that is that the Holocaust must never, ever be forgotten. I'm 92 now and have resolved that as long as the Almighty gives me the physical and mental strength, I will continue doing what I'm doing today, to speak to people, to help educate hundreds of non-Jewish youngsters in schools. The number I've spoken to over the years, the decades that I've been speaking, runs into many thousands and is still continuing. but there's also quite a strong interest in non-Jewish adult firms wanting to hear from a Holocaust survivor. Unfortunately, they've left it rather late. There are very few of us left who still have the ability to speak about our experiences. But speaking for myself, I will go on doing it. I'm doing another talk tomorrow to a firm in town. I've spoken to household names like Google, the head office of NatWest Bank, HSBC Bank. I've spoken to the Bank of England. The people are interested, and I know what I do is just a drop in the ocean, but nevertheless, drops do add up. And all of us, including all of you who are hearing me today, never ever keep silent, and never ever keep what you heard here today to yourselves. Spread the knowledge of the Holocaust as best you can. Many youngsters who hear me speak and join a sort of educational course organized by the Holocaust Educational Trust, which is called Lessons from Auschwitz. And often sixth formers are invited to join this course. Many come back so profoundly impacted by what they have learned that they volunteer to act as ambassadors for the Educational Trust and themselves organize meetings which they address and in turn educate other youngsters to take the place of survivors who are no longer able to do it. And I invite you to do what you feel you can to likewise continue educating people. That, I think, is the most effective way of ensuring that this type of atrocity, unprecedented, I believe, in human history, will never recur. Thank you.
Mr. Goldberg, thank you again for giving the time to speak to our group. You have been an inspiration. It's been a real privilege to be able to hear from you. Quite rightly, you were awarded a BEM for your services to Holocaust education, and Hashem should give you the strength to be able to continue educating people. It's so important, the message that you spread. I'll end with a quote I think it's correctly attributed to you when you said that you feel revenge on the Nazis is the building of a lovely family. We wish you and your family good health, simchas and nachas, and we thank you again so much for taking your time to spend the evening with us and sharing your story. Wish you well, and thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Mr. Goldberg. Really, really appreciate it. I'm sorry we had to rush you.
You know, I understand that there's also sort of a time limit for the youngsters to concentrate on what they hear.
Yeah, no, it's very, very powerful. I'm sure they will not forget hearing what you said, as I do. And every time I hear you, it's an absolute privilege. And I wish you, as I said, I wish you well and your family well, and good things, good health.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.